Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12B live lesson for today. Now, today is a special lesson because this is the last one. Yay! We're on the fifth lesson of Unit 3, which is titled The Modern Novel, and it is the last lesson for the class. So let's not waste any time and let's jump right in. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and we're just going to jump right into the lesson with slide number 5. Move myself up here really quick so I'm not as much in the way. Okay, so this lesson is on the modern novel. So that means how novels have evolved to be the way that we consider them to be today. So this lesson starts off with a reminder of what modernism is. So modernism is a type of writing movement that took place after World War One. And it basically emerged or came out during a period of political and economic gloom. So this was after the war. People were very devastated from the number of people who were lost in the war. Things with money and social movements were not moving the way that people were expecting them to. Um, Television and journalism showed that the government was not telling everyone the truth about how the war was going and what it was like for people to stop the general public from having worries about what was going on. So there was a lot of skepticism and questioning, and also just cynicism, being negative about the possibilities of things. So this was very different from how things were before. Before, people really trusted their governments. People thought that you should basically trust the information that was given to you by people in charge. And knowing that there was such a big difference between what was being shown and what was actually happening and how people were being affected, as well as the way that soldiers were coming back from World War One, pushed people to pretty much think a lot differently and be more critical of the people who were empowered. So it says here in the lesson that in many ways it was a revolution in thought and culture, and that's absolutely true. So then they give you a little more information here. Around the same time, a string of startling discoveries and groundbreaking theories changed the face of science as well. So all of these things are happening at the same time. I know sometimes it's difficult to picture history other than in a straight line, because that's how we learn about things with timelines and such. However, um, a lot of things in history happen in different places at the same time. And try to remember, even in terms of um, English speaking countries that contributed to like English literature, a lot of things happen in those countries, in those places where people were speaking English at the same time and writing and doing all that stuff as well. Even just thinking about the United States, it's such a big country, right? So discoveries can be being made like in California and in New York at the same time. Um, and things can be happening in Canada and the US and Europe at the same time too, even though they're all English speaking, mainly English speaking countries. So it's important to remember that nothing in history happens in a vacuum. People discover things, stuff happens, and then as a result of that, um, people write about the things that are discovered, or they're influenced by the stuff that is discovered. So here's some of the things that were discovered during this time, um, during and after the war, where people were leaning more on science, is basically what it is. Science was becoming very prominent. We were discovering more and more that technology was used to do things during the war. So people were leaning very heavily on it around this time. So they give you three things. They give you Max Planck's quantum theory. So it's basically the idea that formed like the very first rules that inspire people to study physics. So he basically worked with atoms, which were the smallest particles known to man at the time, um, and protons, neutrons, that sort of thing. So he was coming up with rules about how those things fit together and work together to help build the universe. Einstein's theory of relativity in 1905, they give you the years. Basically, he was just discovering that gravity affects the shape of space and the flow of time. So, not just our physical bodies, but also the way that we experience time is affected by gravity as well. And this is when people were first starting to figure out or formulate ways that we could potentially go to the moon. So we've got Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. So most people have heard of Sigmund Freud. He is a psychiatrist, and he worked in the field of psychology. And a lot of his work is about the subconscious and how things that we experience in our childhoods affect how we are today. Now, some of the things that he's known for have been disproven since then, but the important thing to note is that this is when he was popular and discovering things that we would use as building blocks later on. So the stuff that he wrote about in terms of how our younger experiences affect how we are when we're older, that really was new to people. And they were influenced by the idea of that. And you could see that stuff reflected in writing of the time. Because once people get a new idea that someone hasn't heard before, they think, oh, wow, this makes things different. Looking back at, like whatever may have happened in their life and the lives of people they know. This might be the reason why things turned out the way they did. What if I wrote a story about that? What if I wrote a story about that going differently for these reasons? So all of those things are interconnected and they affect how people deal with writing and storytelling. So it says here, basically what I said, the shifts in how people perceived or see themselves and reality coming from the realm of science inspired writers to think about their craft in new ways. In fact, experimentation is one of the hallmarks of modernism. Yeah, trying new things, trying to write things outside of the box, trying to do something different, how people say now, is one of the things that was brought in by modernism. Before, it was considered, like more honorable or respectable to follow the rules of older writing at that time and carry it into the writing that you are doing now. But modernism brought in experimentation and doing something new as something that was cool and that people could be actually known for and acknowledged for instead of like shunned or considered weird. Okay, moving on to slide 6. We get a little more information about the experimentation part of everything. So modernist writers continually tested the boundaries of what was considered literature. So what is considered writing and storytelling. And they tried to, or sought to, that means to look for, to seek, to break from traditional structure of the novel. So they adopted a looser style of narration that sometimes looked like a diary of one's private thoughts and observations without any specific sequence or attempt to polish the details. So what they're saying here is a lot of the stuff that was happening with the war and people's experiences led modernists to think, oh, well, if I wasn't like an acclaimed writer, if I wasn't classically trained, how would a normal person experience their life within this story? And can I have my story reflect that instead of just following the rules of what everyone else does? And they give you some of the questions that modernists asked themselves here. So why, a modernist might ask, must I follow a plot on the typical path beginning with exposition and ending in resolution? So why does a story have to be told in order? But sometimes when we think in our heads, we are able to connect things that happened before with things that are happening now. So for example, flashbacks, right? We see those in movies and stuff all the time. Where you're with someone in a story in the moment that the action is happening right then, and they think back, right, to the past and things that happened to them previously. Now, when you do that, that's telling the story out of order. When people were writing before, they wouldn't have flashbacks that gave you that much detail. Sometimes a character would have thoughts that explain to you things that happened in the past. So they will be thinking about it at the moment of the story, thinking about their past. And if they phrased it right, you would get a little insight. But modernists are where you started to see whole sections or chapters that were just like italicized or grayed out to show that you were viewing something that happened in the past. For like the preface or the epilogue or even just in the middle of the story. There are some books now that will give you a whole chapter of something that happened in the past to help the reader understand what the character is going through now. And for modernists, they're the ones who pioneered or started to do these kinds of things. They also question, why can't a novel start at the climax? Why does a novel always wrap up so neatly at the end? So the climax is the highest point in the story, right? It's when all the tension and everything reaches its peak, and it's when the characters have to make a decision about what it is that they are going to do. They're dealing with a problem. They know that they have to figure it out one way or another. The climax is the point where you can't put it off any longer. You have to do something. It's that point in a book. So if you start a book at the end, or if you start a book at the climax, I'm sorry, if you start a book at the climax at the most like intense part, it might intrigue the reader to want to know, oh, how did we get here? So if you've ever seen that meme online where they have like the record scratch and it's like, oh, I bet you're wondering how I got here. That is exactly the type of thing that was put into play by modernist writers. Whenever you're looking at that in a movie or a book, that is the book starting at the climax. And then they go back to show you how the character got to that exciting point where all the action is happening. So modernists were the ones who put that into play so that people could do it. Before, it would be considered weird or just straight up bad writing for you to do that. But modernists were like, let's experiment with how we tell stories. Let's put the pieces in different order. What if the story ends and it's just not great? What if the character's going through something and there's just no way there can be a happy ending? They played around with what was expected to be in a book at the time to make something different. So they give you an example of people even challenging what is fiction, what is writing. It says here, for instance, the French modernist Flaubert famously claimed that he would love to write a book about nothing. So just being able to write a book that doesn't feel like a book or that doesn't give you any actual important information, just the idea of what counts as a story. And it's kind of at this part that we're looking at storytelling as art, and not just entertainment, because that's really what books were considered to be. A lot of the time, you were either writing to preserve instruction so that people could understand how to do something, to preserve history so people knew what happened in a place, or for entertainment. The novel originally was made, and we went over this in previous lessons, but the novel was originally a way for people to be entertained when they had more free time, especially after the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. The merchant class, so people who sold goods, and the rich who were making money by like owning factories and things. Once factories became more automated or streamlined, you know, like you had a process for doing everything, manufacturing, making things became much faster. People didn't have to constantly look over materials. So people at the top who had money had more free time. Even merchants and some lay people, depending on what job you had, also have free time. So novels originally word for expression and entertainment. So the modern novel definitely is a form where people were experimenting with, well, what if books were not even about that? What counts as a story? And they started looking at it from a more artistic point of view. And then it says here, lastly, some writers took to calling their works books instead of novels to show that they broke away from tradition. So even that small thing, we call novels books now. Anything that looks like a book, we call a book now. Before, everything used to have technical words based on like their size and how many pages they were. And we do still use novel to describe books of a certain size. Um, but if you're referring to books in general, you can call a story a book. This is a book. It doesn't matter if it's thick or thin, it could be a book. And it wasn't like that before. So even what we call books now has changed based on what the modernists did. Okay, so now we're moving on to slide 7. And this gives you a very useful chart. So this is just a difference between Victorian writing and modernist writing. So this is just trying to show you what the difference was between what people thought about writing then and what they think now. So here we have Victorian, which is emphasis on the real and external experience about social life. We have art as social criticism, traditional elements of plot, including neat resolutions, long and dense works with multiple characters, and authorial intrusion and direct address to the reader. So this part right here, I want to explain. Authorial means anything having to do with the author. So intrusion is when you butt in, when you cut into something. So if you have authorial intrusion, it means that there were sections of a book where the author would break away from the story and directly tell you, this is what I want you to get out of it. This is the message that's here. This is what I am saying. And then we have concern about social problems and a quest for better society. Now, on the modernist side, we have a very different thing. So in the Victorian age, there was emphasis on the real and the experiences of social life. But in modernist writing, there's emphasis on the internals and psychological interpretations of reality. So this is partially because of the war. A lot of mental illness happened from the people having PTSD and the way that they suffered. So a lot of writing turned to focus on what people were going through on the inside and not just descriptions of what was happening. Next, we have artist social criticism. So criticism, meaning that people criticized pretty much like how people were interacting with each other socially. So the way that people interact in society is what we call social. So artist social criticism means that people wrote things and people made things in terms of art to show what they thought was wrong with society. And here on the modernist side, we have art for art's sake, and that's aestheticism. So aestheticism is the fancy word for art for art's sake. Now, to explain what art for art's sake is, it basically is a movement that says you don't have to have a reason to make art. You can just make art because you want to make it. So basically, you don't have to have a message. If you think that something looks good or expresses something on the inside and you just want to get it out, people should be allowed to make art just to make it. It shouldn't have to have a point. So the third thing we have here is traditional elements of plot, including neat resolutions. So traditional means, old school. We're talking old-timey stuff. And elements of plot here are the events that happen in a story. So in terms of elements of a plot, we're talking exposition, that's the beginning of the story, where we meet the characters and the place that they're in. We have rising action, which is where whatever problems they're dealing with start to escalate and become an issue. Then we have the climax, which we talked about before. That's the most intense part of the story where people are forced to make decisions. They have to change something or do something. The falling action is right after that when we see the results of the decision that was made and how things play out. And then the resolution is the end where we wrap everything up. Sometimes in the resolution, we get to see what happens to the characters after after the story is over. Sometimes we think of that as an epilogue, but traditionally you could include that in the story in like a separate chapter. Now, for the modernist side, there's none of those things. So absence means it's missing. So absence of typical plot elements or order. So sometimes you would just skip certain things. You would start in the middle. For example, if you have a book about war, maybe you want to show people how chaotic it is to be in the trenches. You start in the middle. You don't know who anybody is. You have to pay attention to which names are used, what people are calling each other or other people to get more information about what's going on. Doing things like that, taking those risks and telling the story in a different way without giving everyone everything in like neat order is part of the modernist movement. Now here we have long and dense works. Dense means thick, right? So long and dense works with multiple characters. So long works with a lot of stuff in them. Dense in terms of writing means that there's a lot of information there. And on the modernist side, the length of the works vary, so there's no standard. But the emphasis is usually on the experiences of one central character. And that's affected a lot of things that we have now. I think that most standard books have just one protagonist, and that's what we focus on. Even if you think about comics, right? Comics have lots of characters. Sometimes there's crossovers and things like that, and you can actually see how different characters work together. But when you look at the books that are about the characters, the emphasis is on that one character. When you read a Superman comic, for example, or a Batman comic, you expect the book to mostly be about them. In traditional Victorian writing, people would write about a lot of characters at once. Think like Game of Thrones. You would have the story focusing on multiple characters at once, giving them equal spotlight. And that's a traditional type of storytelling thing that's gone over into lots of different mediums. So there are movies that show both of these things. There are some movies that are more modernist, where you follow one person's adventure through a whole story. There are movies where the main character swaps from scene to scene. Say maybe something like Ocean's 11, right? Where you've got a team of people who are trying to pull off a plan, a heist or something like that. If you haven't seen that movie, it's fine. The important thing is there's a lot of characters, and the movie changes to focus on each one to show the audience exactly what each person is doing. Just like Game of Thrones, each chapter is from the perspective of a different character so that you can get an idea of what's going on. That's more of the older Victorian style. There's even stuff like anime too, or video games, where different chapters focus on different characters in that old Victorian style. Like if for anyone who's familiar with Naruto, that is one of those things. There's so many characters, some of the story beats and plots and arcs focus on different groups, villages, different characters, so that you can see as an audience the different perspectives of what's happening. In the modernist view, you focus on one character. So like in the realm of like anime or something like that, you could name like I don't know, something old like Yu Yu Hakusho, or something like Demon Slayer, which is newer. You follow mostly one character. Sometimes you'll break off to get information that's important to that main character by looking at what other people are doing. But for the most part, you focus on just the protagonist and what they are doing. That's the more modernist way. And it's important to be able to connect the old and new ways of writing things to what's happening now, because people use both. If we did everything one way, it would be very boring. So a lot of the time people will reach back and look at old works and say, oh, I think that whatever these people did might work for my story. And that's why we have books and movies, anime, all types of things that do different things. And it's important to learn about how they developed so that you can recognize the difference between them. It's very easy to read or watch something and think like all stories are the same, but they are not. There are differences in terms of how they are structured and how they're written. And it's important for you to be able to point out what is different about them and to know that one thing is not the same as the other thing. Stories don't just show up the way they are for no reason. There's history behind all of the decisions that get made when people write a story, even if it doesn't seem like it. Okay. Down here we have authorial intrusion. So we talked about that. That's when the author breaks away from the story to tell the reader things directly. So that's an older type of style. Sometimes we get that in movies too, where like the movie will pause, everything will go gray, and then someone will like look at the screen and address the reader. Or in some cases, you'll get like a voiceover with the thoughts of the character who's looking back on the events of the film as you're learning about things to give you information. That's old style, that's Victorian. In the modernist way of doing things, there's an absence of the author's voice in favor of the central character's voice. So instead of the author poking their nose in and saying, hey, I'm separate from these characters, but here's what I want you to learn. Here's what I've learned while I'm writing this. Instead, the modernist writer focuses on the characters delivering whatever message they have. They separate themselves from the book entirely, so the author and the character are not really the same. And then down here we have a concern about social problems and quest for better society. That is what people wanted in the Victorian age. There were quite a few problems. People wanted to seek things to get better, especially because the Industrial Revolution happened during the Victorian age. So it's important to just note that people were using literature to suggest solutions to problems. Oliver Twist is an example of that, where basically the goal was to encourage people to not discriminate against the poor or impoverished, and to realize that everyone is the same, and the only difference between two men or two women is where they were born and how much money they have. And also just there were other suggestions about changes to society that need to be made for people to be better. And on the modernist side, we have a cynical or pessimistic outlook. So most people after the war felt very pessimistic. They felt like things will never change. So what they can do is comment on how awful it is. And instead of trying to seek out solutions, they just wanted to show people what it was like and to try to embody what people were feeling at the time, at least certain groups of people. Now, here's a list of some of the best known British writers. T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats and E.E. Cummings, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. And there's going to be some selections from those last two. So James Joyce and Virginia Woolf in this lesson. So now we're moving on to slide 8, which is the characteristics of modernist writing. So we went over some elements of these, like really big umbrella ideas like the experimentation. But here they're going to go into a little more detail about things that could be found in modern writing. So we're starting here with experimentation. We kind of went over that, so I won't spend very long on it. Deliberate and jarring breaks from traditional approaches to plot. So sometimes they would start in the middle and do flashbacks to the beginning. Sometimes they would start in the future and then go all the way back and then work your way up. Sometimes you start in the middle and then go back a little bit and then go further into the future and then go further back and then go all the way to the end and then go back to the beginning. Sometimes people do that. If you've ever seen a book where people just remember things that happened to them in childhood and it's not in order, and those sort of like interrupt the storytelling, that's in one of the experimentation things. You move the plot points or the events around. And I'm saying books, but this happens in movies too. So if you've watched a movie that was structured like this, makes perfect sense. Now, the next one is perspectivism. So when we're looking at perspective, we're talking about point of view. So that's how one person or a group of people views things. So in writing and in storytelling, it means locating or finding meaning in the viewpoint of the individual instead of some larger truth. So basically, instead of trying to teach someone a lesson, it means finding meaning in what a person is going through. So like if you're thinking of moral of the story, don't be greedy, help out others. Sometimes those things don't help people because we all know those things, right? But that doesn't really help us feel like we're being seen or heard. Sometimes it's important to just see a character or a story that represents you as a person, so that you can just feel validated in that you're not the only person who's struggling the way that these characters are struggling. So we've got down here some features of perspectivism. So use of narrators located in the action of the story instead of a third person. So basically, the narrator, the person telling the story, is usually one of the characters who is actually in the story. That way, everyone who's experiencing the story can know that person's thoughts and know what's happening. So that helps you to know what their point of view is. We've got the use of multiple perspectives within one work. So that is when the people who are interacting get to tell you all about what they think at the same time. In a lot of books, you wouldn't get that. You would get characters that show up and that do things, but the book itself wouldn't talk about what those people think and what they're going through. So modernism was sort of showing off, yeah, some people think the opposite and their thoughts clash, but they both make good points. So let's include both sides in this story so that people can decide what they relate to or make comparisons themselves instead of kind of like railroading them or steering them to think just one thing. And then use of meta narrative, which is a story that's told to justify or contextualize another story. So this has to do with like flashbacks or having a character explain a story inside of a story. And that's when you're using a small, shorter story inside of your story to give meaning to the bigger one. So this happens in movies all the time. Like if you've ever seen someone do like a flashback to something that's happened in their history, and the events or the story that you witness in that flashback relates to how things are going now, that's definitely meta narrative. You're stepping outside of the story to give the people watching or reading more information that pulls everything together. For those of you who play games, for example, the Dark Pictures anthology, who did like Until Dawn or The Quarry, they use this a lot. They give you like a preview or like a prologue that shows something happening to a family or a group of people, and that small story of what happened to them is supposed to relate to the bigger story that you're getting to in the game. And so people do this in movies, games, books all the time. You're using one story inside of a bigger story to make connections. So the next one we have here is representation of inner reality. So this is one of those things that's influenced by science, the way that we covered in the first couple slides. So this is specifically about psychology and how the mind deals with things, especially dreams. So a lot of modernists used techniques to try to show the personal experiences of a character and how they experience things. So that people who are reading or watching can understand not just what's happening in the world around them, but how the character thinks of what's happening. So if you've ever seen a film with someone that like has a mental illness, or something like Inception, where you're figuring out what's going on the inside, and and it's a little different than what's happening on the outside. The representation of inner reality came from psychology in this way. And the features of that is stream of consciousness writing. So this is like when you're writing sentences nonstop to represent how people think. And then impressionism, which is when you use sensory language. So that has to do with the senses. So eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and hands for touch. It's when you use language to language like that to give people a sense of what's happening on the inside. So for example, you could write a paragraph about someone touching velvet, and you could just actually say, this person touched velvet, they didn't like how it felt. Or you could go in depth and say this person's hands dragged across the material, and it felt rough to the hand in a peculiar way that made them rub it over and over. It felt like the material was clinging to them. It felt disgusting, and they decided to wipe it off on another surface, right? So you can use fancy and more complex words to give someone an idea, not just about what's happening, but how someone's feeling on the inside while it is happening. If you think of words or phrases where people say, like, those words cut like a knife, or even though someone just said something to them with words and not anything else, um, maybe they winced, right? As if in pain, even though no one's touched them. All of those kind of descriptions give you a representation of what the person is feeling on the inside. Next is figurative language. Figurative language is when you're using language that's not literal. That's basically what it is. It's a difficult concept for some people, but if you're not saying the literal or actual definition of the words, you're using figurative language. So, for example, if you were to say, I drove to the store, right? I drove. So I drove to the store. That means you got in your car, you turned the car on, you let it run, and then you used your car to get to the store, right? But say you were rushing, maybe, and you could describe that as, I drove quickly to the store. So that word quickly tells us that you went fast, right? If you wanted to use figurative language, you could say something like, I got in the car and flew to the store, right? So I got in the car tells us that you're driving, but you literally cannot fly in a car, right? You're using the word flew to give someone the picture of you moving so fast it seems like you're flying to get to the store. So that's a figurative way. Obviously, cars can't fly. So you're not literally saying that your car flew, right? You're trying to communicate using that kind of language that you got there very quickly. So that's what figurative language is. It's when you're saying something in a creative way, that is not literal. So they give you examples of the types of figurative language that was used in modern culture and writing. So we have symbolism, and that's when items represent something. So, for example, of a symbol, the eagle in the US symbolizes freedom. So whenever you see an eagle, you're supposed to think, caca, freedom, right? In books, certain items represent other things. Usually cages represent being trapped, right? Usually if it's not an eagle and you see like a bird flying, it represents freedom because birds can go and roam wherever they want. There are other things like hearts representing love. So, for example, a broken or injured heart will represent heartbreak. Those are ideas that we've put together with those items to communicate those ideas. Now, some symbols are very well known, like the ones that I just mentioned. But when you're writing a story, you can also make a symbol by telling or showing us that one of the items in the story represents something important. So, for example, if you are in a story where you're looking for buried treasure, right? That treasure can represent more than just money or being rich. If even if we're doing, like a cheesy sort of story, we're like, what if the treasure was the friendship the friends we made along the way, or whatever. The treasure can actually represent that. It can represent, this is what the journey was for. This is the most important thing that happened here. And if the story changes so that the treasure itself, like the physical object they're looking for, is no longer the most important thing by the end of the story, it can definitely represent as a symbol the trip itself and everything they went through to get to it. So that's symbols. The next one here is allusions. So allusions are references to Greek culture and mythology. It's really references to anything old that might be recognizable. So if you reference the Bible in your story, Jesus or something like that, most people know who that is. So that's what an allusion is. But for modernist writing, most of the time when they were referencing old things, they would reference Greek culture. So most modernist writing will reference, like Zeus or Athena or Hades, because those are the most memorable characters. And then here, the last one, we have metaphors. So metaphors are when you compare two things that are not alike to express something creatively. So if you say her eyes are my son, right? You're saying that this person's eyes and being able to see them, being able to see the person in general, is as important to you as it is for the sun to rise, which is very important because we literally need that light to live. So you're drawing a comparison between something you need and who this person is. And lastly, we have themes. So as we know, themes are big messages or ideas that are put into a work that people are supposed to be able to spot while they're reading after they're finished with the book. So they give you a list of themes that are usually found in modernist writing. So we have the question of the reality of experience. Is this real? Is what I'm experiencing real? Am I the weird person and this doesn't happen to anyone else? Or does this happen to other people too and I just don't know? There's the loss of meaning in the modern world. Why are things important? Why are we here? What is the point? The search for meaning in a world without God. Again, this is related to the Great War. A lot of people started questioning their religion after experiencing the war or talking to other people who experienced the war. There's also a critique of traditional values. So just if the old ways are not working and they don't help us with the situation we're in now, is it actually important to keep those traditions and do those things? The world was changing. The old way of doing things doesn't reflect the stuff that people are learning and going through now. And that's something that most people can relate to even now in uh, the postmodern era. So then we have difficulty of communication. So how hard it is to talk to people, just in general. Talking to people was difficult after the war for a lot of reasons, including a lot of mental health related reasons, but there's also just thinking about how different everyone is, especially in America where we've got the whole melting pot thing going. There's lots of people from lots of different cultures and things. It's very difficult to get your ideas across when everyone has different experiences. And then there's also the search for self, most commonly by the hero of the novel. So by the search for self, it's just who am I? What defines me? What's actually important to me? What is it that I'm trying to do in life? Those were questions that were often answered, or at least mentioned in these books. Okay. Oh, whoops. Alrighty. So slide number 9 goes into postmodernism. So postmodernism is during the middle of the 1900s or the mid 20th century, as they have here. I'm going to repeat this for the last time in this lesson, even though I've said it in many of them before. If you are trying to figure out what century year it is, take the number that they give you for the century. So here they gave us 20th, right? You're going to subtract 1, that'll give us 19, and then add double zeros, right? So the 20th century is the 1900s. And if we're talking the mid 20th century, that means that we take that 1900s and we go to the middle, which would be 1950. So somewhere around the 1950s, a new movement began to emerge called postmodernism. So in the 1950-ish area, this was after World War II. So remember, modernism is the response to World War I, the Great War. Postmodernism is the response not only to that, to modernism itself, but also to World War II. So it says in some ways, postmodernism was an extension or continuation of modernism. So they experimented with form and language and rejecting traditional values. But it's important to note, postmodernism largely emerged as a reaction to modernism. So postmodernism was people reacting to what modernism was. So they're not exactly the same. That's why we have two different words for them. They're similar, but they are not the same. Today, modernism and postmodernism are both influential, but in different ways in different genres. So now they start talking about postmodernism, so you can see the difference between those two things. So we've got in literature, postmodernism is at once more serious and more absurd than modernism. So they give you the definition of absurd just so that you don't misunderstand them. Absurd is the sense of lacking meaning or purpose. So something, not just something that's fun or comedic, but something that is just being done for no reason. That's what they mean when they say absurd. So they give you comparisons here. Modernists tried to find meaning in a world without God, but postmodernists claimed that there was no meaning in anything. So that sort of nihilistic culture. A lot of postmodernists looked at the things that people were doing and basically just said, life is random, nothing really happens on purpose. And if it did, good people will be rewarded and bad people will be punished. But that's not how the world works. So everything is just happening for no reason, and why should I care? That's kind of the attitude that postmodernists had. And because of that, postmodernists were more likely to use dark humor or absurdity. Again, that's things happening like for no rhyme or reason. So postmodernists were accused of not treating serious issues with the respect that they deserved. And that's because if you're looking at the point of view from postmodernism, there's no meaning in anything, so nothing is sacred. And they give you a table to examine the differences. So just like we got that table with Victorian and modernism, we now have postmodernism and modernism. So we're just going to go through these and start from the top. So for modernism, we have an emphasis on internal psychological interpretations. We went over that already. That's like how people are feeling on the inside. In postmodernism, there was emphasis on social constructs, and the way that humans define their own reality. So here was focusing on each individual person and how they interpreted things. But postmodernists look at the way that culture shapes people and how people break away from culture or lean into it. For modernism, we had art for art's sake. So just making art because you can. And then it says art is exclusive, elevated, and set apart. Yes, this is where art began to strongly be elevated as like, you can be an artist and make money if you're making art. And postmodernism was art as expression. So art as, this is me trying to show people who I am through art, and showing how life influenced me to make this art is postmodernism. So making art just to make art on the left with modernism, and art as expression of the self to show people what life is like through art. For modernism, we have the absence of typical plot elements. So we talked about doing things in different orders and stuff. So here we have blending of literary genres, blurring the lines between fact and fiction, and the exploration of high culture and low culture. So especially in America, high culture and low culture were a thing. You definitely had like fancy high class people doing their thing, and you had your everyday layperson living a completely different life, and people wanted to show that in their writing. Now, in terms of blending genres, it's basically smashing two types of stories together. So modernists put stories in different order, but they still kept to the same categories. When you get to postmodernism, think about, like, for example, movies that have come out somewhat recently. So like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, right? That's a historical fantasy about going back in time and thinking about what if Abraham Lincoln was a vampire hunter, right? So we're blending two genres together. One that has to do with fiction, like historical fiction, telling us what happened in older classical times, and the other is just fantasy and action and fighting. strange creatures. So someone thought, hey, let's blend these together. And they do that with a lot of other genres too. Django is another example of that. We get a lot of fantasy elements, Western elements, along with stuff like historical, um, along with things like, so for example, spy films. Spy films are also a mashing together of genres. Normally, a spy film would be an action or adventure, but we've blended it to try to make it seem realistic, like we're telling an actual story about super spies that are doing all these like cool, crazy things, and we have technology in there, so there's like a little tinge of sci-fi to some stuff. Um, we've got a lot of stories that are so for example, the Halo video game series, if you've ever heard of that. We've got space marines happening there, so we have a military story that's mixed with sci-fi. You could say the same thing about like Mass Effect, for example. So with games and movies and postmodernism, we're blending the lines of different types of genres and categories of stories and just sort of smushing them together to try to find something that's interesting. And in those stories, there's usually a very big difference between people at the top and people at the bottom. And to show the difference between those cultures and how they treat each other, those usually feature in those stories. So in the modernism section, we have self-discovery and search for self, and postmodernism is fragmentation of the self. So self-discovery, trying to figure out who you are, is modernist. Fragmentation here means the breaking apart of the self. So the different pieces that we show different people for different reasons. Postmodernism put an emphasis on that. The fact that you speak differently to your pastor at church than you do to your friends at school, or that if you're hanging out with your dad or one of your parents, you talk to them differently than you talk to maybe like your school counselor or a teacher that you really like. Just the emphasis on showing the different pieces that people put together that make up themselves. And sometimes how those pieces can be broken if we go through traumatic effects and we can become different. So here we have perspectivism next, emphasis on the internal experiences. That's kind of similar to what we had up here. But we have movement away from perspectivism. So there's emphasis on cultural construction of meaning. So in postmodernism, instead of focusing on every individual's point of view and experiences, a lot of postmodernists focus on, here's how my background shaped what I think. So you can sort of see that in stories that we have today. People are curious about, so what inspired you to think this way? People will go through their history. Well, this is what my parents taught me. This is what I learned from a friend, or this is what I learned from this experience or from being in this place at this time. And I adopted it to become, who I am today. So that's postmodernism. And then next we have absence of the authorial voice. So we don't have the author poking in anymore. And here we just have varied narration styles. So postmodernism kind of reached back to old styles and just said, well, I'll just pick whatever works. Instead of just looking at one thing and saying, no, that's the thing I don't want to do, they just said, well, I can probably use different things for different situations. So let's use all of them. So basically what this is saying is, since modernism opened up the way for experimentation, postmodernists were able to actually go back to old forms of writing that weren't popular anymore or that people hadn't seen in a long time and say, oh, cool, I think my story will be different and interesting if I use this. No one's seen this in a long time. And that's postmodernism. So no one's doing anything in any one set style. Modernism has a serious tone. And as we talked about before, there's a lot of absurdity, right, and nihilism in postmodernism. So there's a rejection of seriousness. There's sort of like if I'm living through this and I'm suffering and I can't laugh, then what's the point? So people just sort of not necessarily made fun, but tried to show dark humor when it comes to anything, and they didn't really leave room for any exceptions. Remember, on the previous slide, it said that nothing is sacred. And then the last one here, we have a cynical and pessimistic outlook. And postmodernism was just like, there's no meaning in anything. Modernists, being cynical and pessimistic just means this isn't going to go well. What are we going to do if it doesn't go well? How do we adapt to things being terrible? Let me criticize this. But postmodernism is basically nothing matters. So what's the point of criticizing? What is the point of really expecting even bad things to happen? There's just this belief that the human experience is sort of random. It's the looking up at the stars and really realizing how insignificant you are. It's the nothing's happening really for any reason type of thing. Alrighty. So we're going to move on to slide number 10. And then we're going to go to James Joyce. This is our first reading selection. Just as a reminder, I tend not to read the reading selections here. We're going to have separate videos going over the reading selections. But what I wanted to do was at least go over the main points of the authors. So James Joyce is referred to as the founder of the modernist prose movement in Great Britain. So very specifically, he led that movement in Great Britain. So it did happen in the US for sure, but a lot of countries took participation in the Great War, World War I, and Britain was one of them. So he used language to reflect the psychological states of his main characters so that you could actually see the development or the deterioration if they weren't doing so well. To deteriorate means to crumble apart. Some people said that his language is distracting or hard to understand, but he also was very innovative. So he used language in new ways that people were not using them before. And then they mentioned his final work, which is called Finnegan's Wake. It's considered a masterpiece by some, but others just have a hard time getting into it. He was born in Dublin, that's in Ireland, in 1882, and we get some history about him. So his father was not able to work consistently. His mother was a pianist at a Catholic church. For most of his childhood, they struggled to stay out of poverty. And he found success when he moved to Paris for a while. And I believe that's on the next slide. Yeah. At the age of 22 in 1902, he left Ireland for Paris. He worked as a teacher and journalist. He still had financial troubles, but he published Dubliners, which is a collection of short stories in 1914, and that's where he started getting popular. He also published A Portrait of an Artist as a young man, Exiles, which is a play, and Ulysses in 1922. All of those things were hits, and he was pretty well known. So he died in 1941. But he believed in experimentation in the artistic process, and he paved the way for a lot of people in the modernist and postmodernist movements. So then they go into The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which is one of the things that he wrote. It's a semi, so that means kind of, autobiographical. Auto means you did it yourself. Biography is a story of your life. So autobiographical is a story of your life that you wrote yourself. So it's kind of semi-autobiographical. So that means to say some things were made up, but some things were directly taken from his life. And it was an account of James Joyce's experiences growing up in Ireland and his journey from student to artist. So we have a main character who is not James Joyce. It's Stephen Dedalus. And he goes through some of the things that James Joyce went through when he was younger. So we get a lot of complex feelings and psychology from Stephen in terms of how he feels on the inside and how he is psychologically. He loves his family, but at times he also hates them. He looks up to his dad as leader of the family, but he also looks down on him for the troubles that he has for keeping a job and staying sober. Now, on slide 14, we get a little more information about it being a semi-autobiography. So it says here, Stephen Dedalus is based mainly on Joyce, but his name is also an allusion. So there's a character in Greek mythology called Daedalus, and he was a gifted inventor. He's the one who made the wings for him and his son Icarus to fly out of imprisonment on an island. So if you've ever heard the phrase Icarus flew too close to the sun, this is a part of that story. Basically, Daedalus was able to make the wings, and he gave a pair to his son and one to himself so that they could escape. So he told his son not to fly too high or too low. But Icarus didn't listen because he was so excited to fly, and he flew too close, too high up. The wax that held the feathers together on the wings melted, and he fell to his death. So if you know about that story, the fact that this character's name is Daedalus gives you kind of a hint as to what might happen in the story based on the character he's made out of or named out after. So it says here, the importance of this illusion lies in Daedalus's profession. As an inventor, Daedalus created things, and this reflects Joyce's belief that art is about creation and innovation. Joyce used the stream of consciousness style to develop characters in his novel. So you get to just see the thoughts of Stephen as he's going through life, and it's not really interrupted by anything. Okay. Going over to slide 17, the second author we're going to read a little bit about is Virginia Woolf. She was a founding member of the modernist movement, just like Joyce. So her work is similar to his in that it has a lot of modernist characteristics. The stream of consciousness, parallax. If you remember from earlier, parallax is when you include the viewpoints of multiple people all at once in the story, even if they go against each other or clash. And ambiguous endings. So she didn't work hard to just make everything end happily. So it says here, her work, Mrs. Dalloway, employs all of those mechanisms. So it has all three of these: stream of consciousness, parallax, and ambiguous endings. So then we get more information about Virginia Woolf, right? So she was born in 1882 to a family of 7 children. So she had 6 siblings. Her mother passed away at age 13, which is very unfortunate. And Virginia herself had a lot of mental breakdowns. Her father was pretty strict and didn't really think that women should have the same education as men. But he later allowed Virginia to be educated at home. And eventually allowed them to take courses at a local college. So she joined the suffrage movement in terms of supporting women's voting rights after she went to college. And unfortunately, her life did not really end well. She had a lot of depression and manic anxiety. She did get married to Leonard Woolf, but she had a severe breakdown. And while she was dealing with these, she did a lot of writing. She has a lot of works here, which we list out here in full. So we've got The Voyage Out. We've got Jacob's Room, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, A Room of One's Own, and The Waves. So they give you a little more information about Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf rejected traditional structure. So in Mrs. Dalloway, she starts the book without any type of exposition. So you don't get an introduction to the characters. You don't really learn very much about what they're doing or who they are or where they are. You just have to try to get details from within the story to put it together, almost like you're solving a mystery. But she also, kind of like Joyce, went into detail about the inner feelings and psychology of her characters. She was always concerned with the public's reaction to her work, and many scholars considered her a literary genius by the 1930s because she was doing so many sort of like new innovative things. Um, she unfortunately committed suicide in 1941. So, looking at slide 19 for Mrs. Dalloway, we get a summary of that story, right? So, this is one of her most famous works. It covers one single day from morning to night in one single woman's life. So, remember, we were talking about with modernism, focus on just a single character. That's definitely this. So, it follows, most of the action follows Clarissa Dalloway, who is a wealthy housewife, as she walks through her London neighborhood running errands in preparation for a party that she's hosting that evening. And the book starts pretty abruptly. That means like there's no real beginning. It just says this famous line, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. So it starts in the middle while she's talking and saying something and declaring something. So basically, her life, Clarissa's life, the character in the story, seems happy at first, but it's very easy to tell that it's not as it appears, right? She has a strained, not great relationship with her husband. They're not very close. Clarissa cherishes her privacy, but she also feels sad for the distance that's between them because they're not in love. So she encounters a past love who's Peter Walsh, and he still has feelings for her. So this is a guy that proposed to her years ago, but he never really got over her rejection. So they're dealing with the issue of their past in the story. There's also a parallel plot. So this is a two-track story that follows two different characters. So we get to follow this completely separate character in the story. So we've got a parallel plot follows Septimus, a veteran of World War I who suffers physical and psychological injuries. So basically, he's waiting on an appointment with a psychiatrist. And this psychiatrist happens to be friends with Clarissa. His name is Sir William Bradshaw. And these two plots that are completely separate end up intertwining when Peter hears ambulances on the way to the party, and Sir William arrives late. It explains that a patient of his has committed suicide. So we get to see Septimus's end, basically, as part of the story, and Clarissa's reaction to it, even though she's a stranger. They're really only connected by William Bradshaw going to Clarissa's party. But the intertwining of these two plots and perspectives is called parallax. Because obviously, Septimus is having issues if he committed suicide, and his perspective as a soldier is very different from Clarissa's, who is just a rich housewife. And it says here, although it's quite common today, especially in movies, it was a new technique at the time. And that's what I was saying earlier. You have to remember that all these techniques started somewhere. They were new to someone somewhere. So after they get the news that Septimus committed suicide, Clarissa leaves the party for a moment to think about the death of this soldier that she didn't know. She feels a connection to him just because she can imagine why someone would make that choice. She returns to the party as everyone's getting ready to leave, but she spends that moment, trying to figure out why she feels the connection, and also the issue that she has with William Bradshaw treating life and death so lightly, because she feels it very deeply. And then it ends kind of as suddenly as it began. So as she enters the room, Peter is excited to see her, and that's it. So we don't get to know what decisions that she makes with Peter. We don't get to know how anything unfolds. Excuse me. How anything unfolds with the two of them and how they operate from this point forward. We don't know what happens. in her marriage or anything like that. We don't get to know any of those things. Okay. So here we have a video, and this explains some of the themes, uh, and there's some commentary about World War One and how it affected a lot of people in this video. There's also information about the motif from Mrs. Dalloway. Um, just lots of different symbols and motifs that show up repeatedly in the book. And just some additional detail about it. So if you had a difficult time understanding the explanation that we just got, I would take a moment to watch this video. It's about 5 minutes long, and it is actually the last thing that's in this lesson. The rest of the lesson is just questions on the things that were in this video. So take your time, watch this video, and then go ahead and finish the lesson since it's just the questions from here on out. And then there's a lesson activity. So having got to the end, I'm going to stop sharing. I know that this was kind of a long one because we're sort of wrapping up a lot of, I guess we'll say, modern writing conventions into just one video. But take your time. Hopefully the explanation helped. And if you were able to make it through this lesson, then congratulations. You're done with the course. You just have to, turn in your notes, do your DBA, and then do the finals. It's the last mastery test that you'll have to take at least. If you have any questions about the lesson, please feel free to let myself or any of the other tutors know. Please reach out to your advocate if you're in Step Up. And if you are having any issues with interpreting or getting in touch with us, you can reach out. Give us a call at the main number. We'll connect you to someone and make sure that you get in touch with a tutor to make sure that you're understanding everything correctly. It's the last stretch. We want you guys to do as well as possible. And we wish you guys the best of luck. Alrighty, without further ado, this is Miss Amber signing off. And good luck with your English class. Congratulations. Good luck on the final.